At 0418 hours, the sonar display bloomed with a contact that didn't belong in the North Atlantic. Deep, fast, and moving like it knew exactly what it was hunting. The sea above was iron black under low, shredded cloud. Wind from the northwest at 24 knots threw whitecaps across long, cold swells that made even large warships rise and fall like slow-breathing machines. Air temperature was 3 degrees Celsius. Water temperature 6 degrees Celsius. Visibility was 5 nautical miles in the clearest sectors and less than 2 where sleet bands dragged across the horizon. The kind of weather where the surface looks empty and the undersea world feels louder, closer, more dangerous. Then the contact tightened. New transient, bearing 077, range estimate 9 miles, high speed submerged, classified as Russian attack submarine. And for one long second, nobody spoke, because everyone in that operations room understood what that meant. Russia had sent its deadliest submarine into the lane where US ships moved, and the next 15 minutes would decide whether the ocean stayed quiet or turned into a graveyard. I'm your host at World Defense, where we break down the operations shaping global security. And what happened next wasn't just another underwater cat-and-mouse story. It was a wake-up call for any fleet that thinks distance, weather, or depth can hide intent, and for any commander who believes America will absorb a hunt without answering with overwhelming force. The US formation in this story wasn't a lone destroyer drifting in open water. It was a moving slice of a larger picture. A pair of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers on forward station, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser holding command depth, and a logistics ship pushing fuel and ordnance through a corridor the world only notices when it's threatened. Above them, an MH-60R Seahawk rotated on anti-submarine patrol, dipping sonar into black water and laying sonobuoys in a pattern that looked random to outsiders and like a net to professionals. Farther back, beyond the weather band, a carrier strike group held its own box, not close enough to be bait, but close enough to be consequence. And in the undersea layer, a US attack submarine was already in the same ocean, doing the quiet work that makes surface ships brave. Russia's aggressor in this confrontation was a nuclear-powered attack submarine built to do one thing better than almost anything afloat: hunt ships and survive. A Severodvinsk-class submarine, designed for deep water, long endurance, and high-end undersea warfare. Fast enough to reposition quickly, quiet enough to stalk, armed enough to make a convoy and its escorts feel suddenly fragile. Its mission was not humanitarian. It was not defensive patrol. It was a deliberate hunt. A probe aimed at US naval movement, designed to prove Russia could put a knife under American logistics and threaten the arteries that keep fleets alive. The location was the North Atlantic, a place the world imagines as wide and empty until submarines turn it into a chessboard. And the incident type was the most dangerous kind: an aggressive submarine intercept. A hunt that begins with shadowing and ends, if miscalculated, with a torpedo in the water. At 0419 hours and 12 seconds, the first US destroyer's sonar team promoted the contact from possible to probable hostile based on speed and bearing stability. The submarine was not drifting. It was making a controlled run parallel to the formation at an offset that suggested it wanted options: close enough to attack, far enough to disappear into the weather and depth if the escorts reacted. Subsurface contact, Sierra 2. Bearing 077, range 8.6 nautical miles. Track steady, speed estimated 22 knots. 22 knots underwater in the Atlantic is not transit. It's maneuver. It's intent. On the Russian submarine, the mood was not tense in the cinematic way people imagine. It was professional and cold. The captain didn't need adrenaline. He had doctrine. He had training. He had a plan built around the belief that US surface ships and helicopters can be distracted by weather and commercial noise, and that the Atlantic's layered thermals could be used like camouflage. His crew listened to the machinery tones of American escorts and the deep rumble of a fleet oiler and saw opportunity. A high-value lifeline ship guarded by warships that might be forced to choose between keeping station and chasing a ghost. The Russian plan was simple: get close enough to build a firing solution, force the US to react, and then vanish, leaving nothing but uncertainty and a political message. But the US had already made one decision that Russia could not see. It had assumed the hunt was coming. What they didn't know was that the US Navy had already been tracking the aggressor for 96 hours using surveillance assets. The first indications weren't in the Atlantic at all. Satellite imagery and maritime signals monitoring had flagged unusual submarine support activity at a northern base, compressed timelines, heavy logistics movement, and communications patterns consistent with a sortie. Undersea surveillance cueing and acoustic analysis had hinted at a departure window. A P-8 Poseidon had been tasked days earlier to widen the search lanes and build a fresh environmental picture. Temperature layers, salinity gradients, and the kind of acoustic conditions that determine whether a submarine is invisible or merely hard to find. The US didn't know the exact path the Russian boat would choose, but it knew the objective: find US ships. So it positioned sensors and hunters in the most likely corridors. By the time the contact appeared at 0418, the escorts weren't asking, "Is this real?" They were asking, "How fast do we box it?" At 0420 hours, the US commander issued 2 orders that launched 2 separate wars in parallel: hold formation integrity, begin prosecution, get Seahawks on top of that bearing. The first war was protection. Keep the convoy moving, keep the oiler alive, keep the air defense posture ready in case Russia paired the submarine hunt with another domain's distraction. The second war was pursuit. Find the submarine, force it to run, and if it refused, destroy it. At 0420 hours and 27 seconds, the nearest MH-60R Seahawk turned into the wind and accelerated toward the bearing, flying low enough to avoid worse turbulence and high enough to maintain sensor stability. Its crew went to work like surgeons. Approaching datum. Commence buoy pattern. Request surface units reduce speed to limit self-noise. The escorts complied. The oiler held steady. The destroyers adjusted speed slightly to avoid blasting their own sonar picture with cavitation. In undersea combat, your own wake can blind you. At 0421 hours, the Seahawk began dropping sonobuoys in a tight line across the submarine's most likely escape corridor, spaced to create overlapping acoustic coverage. Each buoy splashed, settled, and started listening. In high sea state, buoys bob, noise rises, and the ocean turns into a messy orchestra. But a nuclear submarine moving at 22 knots is not a violin. It is a drum. At 0421 hours and 34 seconds, the first buoy reported a faint but consistent signature. Contact faint, possible. Bearing trend consistent with Sierra 2. At 0421 hours and 58 seconds, a second buoy confirmed. Contact stronger. Doppler indicates speed above 20 knots. Now it was no longer an unknown. It was a track. At 0422 hours, the US destroyer began shaping geometry. One Burt-class ship turned 10 degrees to starboard to open a clean engagement lane and keep the submarine outside the convoy's direct path. The second destroyer moved to the opposite side, creating a cross-cueing arc that made it hard for the submarine to slip away without being heard. The cruiser held command depth, coordinating both surface and air layers. Over the net, the calm voice of the tactical action officer cut through the weather. Maintain track. Do not lose contact. Prepare weapon release criteria. On the Russian submarine, the captain felt the first shift. Not through sight, but through the ocean's behavior. The water above had changed. Sonobuoys were splashing. Helicopter noise vibrated through the sea in distant pulses. The escort's prop noise changed as they adjusted speed and heading. This was not a convoy surprised. This was a convoy fighting back. The Russian captain ordered a depth change and a turn toward a thermal layer, hoping to smear the acoustic picture. He increased speed to 26 knots briefly, a decision that traded stealth for position. He wanted to slide behind the convoy, where the oiler's noise might hide him long enough to threaten it again. It was a clever move. It was also exactly what US doctrine expects. At 0423 hours and 12 seconds, the Seahawk dropped a dipping sonar and sent it into the black water like a spear. The sonar pulse echoed back as a clean, hard return. Not perfect, but enough. Dipping sonar contact, bearing 078, range 1.9 nautical miles. Track firm. Track firm. That phrase is the end of hope for a submarine trying to pretend it isn't there. At 0423 hours and 44 seconds, the US escalated to the next layer. Weapon free if contact crosses inside 2 nautical miles of the oiler. The Russian submarine was already inside the danger envelope. At 0424 hours, the Russian captain made the mistake that kills submarines. He fired first to regain initiative. At 0424 hours and 17 seconds, the sonar room on the forward destroyer detected a sharp transient. Torpedo launch transient, bearing 080, torpedo in the water. A second later, the Seahawk's crew saw the surface disturbance that no one ever wants to see. A faint, fast-moving line of churn cutting through wave tops. A torpedo wake running shallow for its initial sprint. On the US net, the call snapped clean and loud. Torpedo, 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 execute evasion, deploy countermeasures. The convoy turned into a choreography of survival. The oiler began a hard turn with escort guidance, trying to widen geometry and pull the weapon away. Destroyers streamed tow decoys and launched acoustic countermeasures. The sea behind the ships became an artificial jungle of false targets and noise bursts designed to confuse the torpedo's seeker logic. The Russian torpedo was fast. It was modern. It was lethal. It was also now swimming into a system built to make lethality expensive. At 0424 hours and 52 seconds, the torpedo's wake bent toward a decoy, then corrected, then bent again as countermeasure pulses overlapped. The oiler's turn widened the lane. The destroyer's evasion maneuvers forced the weapon to choose between multiple moving acoustic objects. At 0425 hours and 14 seconds, the torpedo passed astern of the oiler by 0.6 nautical miles and ran out into nothing but decoy noise and cold water. No impact, no hit. But the line had been crossed. Russia had fired a torpedo at US ships in the Atlantic. Now America hit back hard. The hit-back sequence was not emotional. It was procedural violence, executed with speed. At 0425 hours and 26 seconds, the Seahawks tactics officer spoke the words that end an undersea duel. Weapon free, Mark 54, away. At 0425 hours and 34 seconds, a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo dropped from the helicopter and entered the sea with a small splash that hid a large consequence. It ran short, fast, and smart, guided by the very acoustic picture the submarine had just made easier by firing and accelerating. At 0425 hours and 57 seconds, the destroyer joined the prosecution, launching a parallel ASW attack sequence. Redundancy is how you keep a submarine from surviving on luck. The Russian captain heard the first pursuit cue through the hull. The water's pressure shift, the unmistakable sense that the ocean had started chasing him. He dumped countermeasures and went deep, trying to drag the torpedoes into a layer where the seeker might lose him. He increased speed again, hoping the noise would be masked by weather. But he was not in a vacuum. He was in a net. At 0426 hours and 19 seconds, sonobuoy telemetry confirmed the submarine's turn and speed spike. Contact accelerating, bearing change south, speed estimate 28 knots. 28 knots underwater is not escape. It is exposure. At 0426 hours and 41 seconds, the Mark 54 acquired. The helicopter crew saw the cue tighten. The weapon turned with deliberate logic and drove toward the contact. At 0426 hours and 59 seconds, the Russian submarine executed a violent maneuver, hard rudder, depth change, countermeasure ejection. In movies, that's where the hero escapes. In the Atlantic, it's where the track becomes clearer, because every countermeasure release is data. Every turn is a signature. Every speed change is a confession. At 0427 hours and 14 seconds, the first detonation hit near the submarine's aft quarter. It was not a Hollywood fireball. It was a pressure hammer in water, a blunt force physics event that turned steel into stress. The Russian boat shuddered. Machinery alarms screamed. The captain felt propulsion falter. For seconds, the submarine lost clean control. Trim shifted. The depth plane fought to hold. The US did not stop. At 0427 hours and 31 seconds, the second torpedo homed. The contact was now wounded, louder, easier to track. The Mark 54's logic tightened again. At 0427 hours and 46 seconds, the second hit landed. The acoustic signature changed from running submarine to damaged vessel. The boat's speed collapsed. Its turn rate became erratic. A cloud of bubbles rose toward the surface, a dirty column in the sea that no stealth design can hide once it exists. On the US net, the Seahawk crew reported with calm certainty. Contact degraded, no longer maneuvering effectively. Recommend maintain track and prepare follow-on. Maintain track. Do not assume kill. At 0428 hours and 18 seconds, the destroyers tightened the box. One ship held the convoy lane while the other moved to seal the submarine's most likely drift path. The oiler regained steadier heading under escort guidance and increased separation from the engagement area. At 0429 hours, the Russian submarine surfaced, not in triumph, in necessity. A dark shape broke the sea surface amid whitecaps and sleet, a sail rising like a wound. Emergency lights flickered. A hatch opened. Crew shapes appeared briefly, small against the Atlantic's violence. The submarine was alive, but it was no longer hunting. It was surviving. At 0429 hours and 37 seconds, the nearest US destroyer transmitted a command on maritime guard, voice cold and final. Russian submarine, this is United States Navy. Cease all movement. Do not attempt to submerge. You have conducted a hostile act. Comply immediately. The Russian captain did not answer with words. He answered with stillness. At 0431 hours, the US sealed the scene. Helicopters orbited. Sonobuoys remained in place to ensure no second submarine was using the chaos as a cover. Surface ships maintained standoff. The air picture stayed hot. There was no second contact. The hunt was over. The outcome was overwhelming. US superiority expressed in the only language that matters underwater: time. Russia fired first to seize initiative. The US absorbed the threat, defeated the torpedo with layered countermeasures and maneuver, then prosecuted the shooter with aircraft, sonobuoys, and torpedoes in a sequence so fast the Russian boat never regained control. This is what hit back hard looks like in 2026. Not chest thumping, not slogans. A system that turns one hostile launch into a cascade of consequences: detection, evasion, counterattack, damage, surfacing, control. But the story didn't end the moment the submarine surfaced. Because once the shooter is broken, every navy watches how the winner handles the aftermath. And in the North Atlantic, the aftermath is where miscalculation can still trigger escalation. At 0446 hours, the US commander ordered an expanded undersea sweep. Additional sonobuoy lines were laid in a widening arc, not because a second Russian submarine had been detected, but because professional navies assume the worst until the data proves otherwise. The Seahawk rotated to a fresh fuel state, and a second helicopter took station to keep continuous eyes and ears on the water. At 0453 hours, the convoy's oiler resumed a safer track under escort, increasing separation from the incident bubble. The destroyers did not chase the surface submarine closer than necessary. They held standoff with weapons ready but posture controlled, because a cornered submarine is still a platform that can do something desperate. At 0508 hours, the electronic warfare suites listened for new Russian command circuits lighting up. In a real confrontation, the most dangerous moment is the one after the first exchange, when distant commanders decide whether to double down or de-escalate. The US made sure the distant commanders saw the same thing the ocean had already decided: the hunt failed and the shooter was contained. At 0531 hours, a maritime patrol aircraft pushed a broad area confirmation. No additional submerged contacts on the convoy's lane, no fast-moving transients, no coastal anomalies because there was no coastline in this fight. Only open water and consequences. That is when the true deterrent effect landed. Russia's goal had been to show that a high-end submarine could threaten US sea movement and force caution. The outcome proved the opposite, that even a Deadliest platform becomes vulnerable the moment it commits, because the US kill chain is not one sensor or one weapon. It is an architecture that can absorb a first shot and still strike back faster than the shooter can regain control. This is why undersea warfare remains the most unforgiving contest in modern conflict. There are no crowds to hide behind, no smoke to blame, no easy propaganda when the ocean keeps the receipts. You either own the timeline or you become a contact log in a surfaced hull in sleet. And the lesson is ruthless. The undersea domain is not a private hunting ground for whoever is willing to risk it. It is a battle space owned by the side that can fuse sensors, deploy air assets rapidly, and execute a kill chain faster than the shooter can reload courage. A submarine can still threaten ships. It can still fire first. But once it does, it enters a world where every second is tracked, every maneuver is recorded, and every mistake is punished with water pressure and steel. Russia sent its deadliest sub to hunt US ships. America hit back hard. And the Atlantic remembered what it always remembers: the hunter is only safe until the net closes. At 0512 hours, the second phase began. The one fought in data, not detonations. The Hawkeye logs were archived. The destroyers exported sonar recordings, countermeasure timelines, and maneuver tracks. The Seahawk crews preserved buoy telemetry and weapon release data. The objective was not to celebrate a win. It was to ensure the story could not be rewritten. Because in modern conflict, the first battle is who survives the contact. The second battle is who owns the record. And that is why this incident mattered beyond the hulls involved. It proved that even in harsh weather, in deep water, in the ocean domain Russia has trained to dominate, the US can detect, evade, and prosecute faster than a high-end submarine can complete its own kill chain. It proved that a torpedo launch does not create leverage. It creates permission for the other side to end your patrol. The Atlantic didn't just echo the fight, it documented it.